No Politic Here.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the No Politic Here podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Isaac of the Overzealots channel. Isaac, how are you doing today?
Can't complain. Enjoying the weather, playing some tennis.
And we are joined today, it is not just us once again, we are joined today by a historian and an expert in Palestine, Zach Foster. And before, Zach, you introduce yourself, I have a little funny anecdote. So about a year before I met my girlfriend in 2024, she actually sent me your doctoral thesis and she was like, hey, you should read this, it's really good. And I remember looking at it and I was like, oh yeah, this seems like the perfect kind of thing to read, you know, with how discourse is on the internet, especially, and because it's academic and interesting. And I didn't get round to it until this week where I finally read it and I really enjoyed it. So Zach, do you want to kind of introduce yourself and what it is you sort of do?
Sure. Thank you guys so much for having me. I am a historian of Palestine. I did my PhD on Palestinian history. As you said, my dissertation focused on the idea of Palestine, how this word, this concept came into being historically, how it was used historically to refer to what, who used it, when, where, and why, and then ultimately why people started to call themselves Palestinians, and when did they do that? Those were the questions I try to answer in my PhD dissertation. And I, just to say a bit more about myself, I run a website called Palestine Nexus. We publish articles trying to provide historical context for the present moment. That's what I focus on as a historian, but also someone who's trying to speak to the present moment. And we also publish articles from Palestinians in Palestine, primarily Palestinians in Gaza, on reporting on the genocide. And we also offer courses at that on Palestine Nexus on the history of Zionism, Jewish anti-Zionism, a history of the Palestinian people, and a kind of a general overview of sort of Palestine 101.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed your bit recently of replying to people on Twitter saying you should check out Palestine 101 when they post some absolute nonsense.
Thank you.
Because, I mean, I guess, like, to get kind of straight into one of the first things, it's kind of interesting because when you read your thesis, there's a lot of stuff, and I know you kind of like talk to Zionists on the internet, but there's a lot of stuff that's just like, you kind of realize how dumb a lot of the way people, actually most of the discourse online is coming from Zionists versus the academic world. So like, how did you kind of make the transition from, you know, really hard, I guess it's historiography, right, would be the correct term, into into like kind of doing more internet related Palestine things?
I would say the first shift took place when my PhD dissertation advisor actually rejected my dissertation prospectus. That is the document I submitted saying, this is what I want to write my PhD thesis on. He actually rejected it on the grounds that the topic I chose was too obscure. This came as a shock to me as an academic because my presumed place in the universe was irrelevance. And the idea that I needed to be relevant to someone other than myself, that struck me as novel. But ultimately, I think the reason I chose this topic in the first place, right, the history of the idea of Palestine, was because I had been raised with so much propaganda about that very question. If you are raised in a Zionist environment, you already know that there's no such thing as Palestine. You're taught that from a young age, right? These people, they never called themselves Palestinians, right? That's the narrative. That's what you're taught. It's obviously propaganda. In fact, they were calling themselves Palestinians, as far as I can tell, or at least people were calling them Palestinians, as far as I can tell, before the Zionist movement existed. But we can get into that history if you want. But I think ultimately what led me to take more interest in the propaganda side of things was because that's what I was raised with, right? That these are the stories I was told growing up. They never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace.
Right.
They never called themselves Palestinians. All the propaganda, right? They always wanted to push the Jews into the sea. They're inherently anti-Semitic. All of these things that you probably think of as sort of silly propaganda. This is what Jews in the United States and Jews in Israel and Jews mostly, I mean, this Jewish education around the world is for the most part Zionist. And so these are the stories we were raised with as kids.
Yeah, because also I found it quite interesting of like because, you know, you were mentioning people calling themselves Palestinian. In your thing, you mentioned someone who was in 991, right? Mohammed bin Ahmad al-Mughadisi? Murad.
Yeah, so in 991, a very famous Muslim geographer by the name of Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is also known as al-Muqaddisi, so he dies. And he was probably the most important geographer of his era. He traveled around the Muslim world. He traveled to Iran, and he meets this Iranian stonecutter, and he writes about this encounter in his travelogue, his memoir, his treatise. And he says the stonecutter asks him, where are you from? And he says, Ana Falastini, I am Palestinian. And he actually uses the term in multiple other places in the travelogue, in this geographical treatise. So it's very clear there was a Palestinian identity in the 10th century. In fact, there are also hadith transmitters in the Islamic canon. Shaddad ibn Aus is one of them, who refer to themselves or are referred to as Philistini, as Palestinian, in hadith transmissions, right? A hadith is a saying and doing of the Prophet Muhammad, right? So if you think about like the holiest text in Islam, you have the Quran, which is kind of the equivalent of the Bible, let's say in Christianity or Judaism. But then you have the what is known as the hadith, which is sort of in Judaism, it would be equivalent to the Talmud, right? It's the oral tradition, these sayings and doings of the Prophet. And in every hadith, you have a matan and an isnad, the text and the chain of transmitters who transmitted that text going all the way back to the Prophet himself. And in every chain of transmissions, the transmitters themselves are oftentimes referred to by their nisba adjective, the location, the adjectival noun associated with their place of birth or their place of residence. And so Palestine, being an administrative district in the early Ottoman period, you had many hadith transmitters who were referred to as al-Falastini, the Palestinian. So yes, the term existed in the early Islamic period. Exactly how widespread it was, we don't know. It's not obvious, but it was in use.
It's interesting because one of the arguments that I've contended with frequently over the past few weeks, because I've just been engaging with Zionists, which I don't think I should, it's probably not the healthiest habit to have. But the one that I've heard very frequently is actually that Palestinian identity didn't become a thing until 1967. That's a very common trope, which is really funny. Right. And, my knowledge on this is substantially less than yours, obviously. But even just looking into it loosely, it's reading a few books. Noor Masalah's Palestine, A 4,000-Year History is one that I'm a big fan of. But you could see in there, like, they had newspapers. I think it was called Philistine. It was a Jaffa newspaper from 1911. You could see that they would point to, I think it was the Arab National Congress would point to the Iraqi mandate and then demand equality with the Iraqi mandate. And the Iraqi mandate explicitly stated that Iraq would eventually become independent and a nation state. And I think it said something about having a parliamentary democracy. So you could see these are national aspirations that Palestinians have been expressing for a very long time, calling themselves Palestinian, using Philistine, pointing to a mandate that implies or it states explicitly that they are going to get independence. So
the first thing to say here is, like, why aren't there a group of people going around telling you there was no such thing as a Syrian until 1953, or there was no such thing as a Lebanese until 19 whatever? Mm-hmm. Now, the answer, and the reason why there's this narrative telling you, there's these people that are trying to convince you that there was never such a thing as a Palestinian, these people didn't exist, is because the mere idea that there's a Palestinian people is a constant thorn in the side of the Zionist movement and the state of Israel. The mere existence of the population of the Palestinian people is a constant reminder that the Zionist project was built on top of another people. So they would rather try and convince you that these people just never existed at all, rather than try and grapple with the reality that, no, they did exist. Now, that's the first point to make. The second point to make is that regardless of whether or not people in Palestine called themselves Palestinians for the first time in 1967, which we said is obviously false, but let's just suppose they did start to call themselves Palestinians first in 1967. Let's just accept the premise. What does that have anything to do with anything? What does that have anything to do with Israeli forces ethnically cleansing Palestinians in Mosul Faryata or Sheikh Jarrah or anywhere else? Or what does it have to do with Israeli forces carrying out a genocide in Gaza, right? These are like, one is an interesting a question of history. What did people call themselves at this such and such a time and such a place? Another is a question of international law. These are unrelated things. So that's the second point to make. The third point to make is you're absolutely correct. In 1918, the British occupied Palestine. In 1919, you had the first Palestinian Arab National Congress. You had about a few dozen of these delegates. They gathered from all of Palestine's major towns, Tiberias, Jerusalem, Jaffa, Gaza, everywhere. And they met, and they passed resolutions. Actually, in 1919, they opted for unity with Syria. We can get into that episode if you're curious. But basically, from 1920 to 1926, they met every year, and every year they passed the same set of resolutions. We demand a democratic state in Palestine whose government would be elected by the Arabic-speaking peoples of Palestine, the people that lived in Palestine prior to World War I. And so that would include Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The Jewish population in Palestine spoke Arabic. It would not include the foreign settlers who migrated to Palestine against Ottoman law and bought land in Palestine against Ottoman law. But in any case, they demanded a democratic government every year from 1920 to 1926. And guess what the British said? We're not interested in democracy. Democracy was the enemy of the British. Mm-hmm. Because democracy meant Arab rule, not Jewish rule. Yeah. Because Jews were 5-10% of the population.
Right.
Yeah, I guess as well, it was kind of, I guess part of it that was really interesting to me as well was when you started talking about where Syria kind of stood and why it was a thing. Because obviously the King Crane Commission is a crazy document, like going through it and looking at what it says. The fact that it has in it, Israel or whatever the state to be established there will only be maintained through force. There is no chance of doing it any other way. But the part that's always interested me is that Palestinians chose to be part of something called like Greater Syria. And I'd always made the assumption that, well, this was because, the borders were quite porous and people moved around and, not to say that Palestine didn't matter so much, but that if there was like some kind of powerful ruler in that area, that would be someone who they were happy to be with. What you kind of claim in your work is that actually it was much more to do with the notion that this would be one of the ways out of getting out of British rule, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's the real reason. This is not well appreciated. Also, there's a lot of propaganda. The Zionists will tell you they opted the Palestinians overwhelmingly in that 1919 resolution where they called for unity with Syria. The Zionist propagandists will tell you, that's because they didn't care about Palestine. They actually saw themselves as Syrians, like Jerusalemites and Gazans and people living in Nablus and Jenin. They always saw themselves as Syrian. That's what the Zionists will tell you. Obviously, that's nonsense. What happened was that the British in 1917, 1918, they occupied Palestine. Recall that the British the British government in 1917 had issued the Balfour Declaration. In other words, they had said, we're going to transform Palestine from an Arab country to a Jewish country. That was in 1917. And then they occupied Palestine in 1918. And then in 1919, the Palestinians are like, actually, we want to establish unity with Syria. And there's a few things to say here. Number one, that government in Damascus was basically a Palestinian government. I mean, people don't really realize this, but if you look at the rank and file of the political leadership of that Faisal government in Syria from 1918 to 1920, I'm talking about, I would say, a majority, not like a plurality even. I would literally say a majority of the most senior figures in that government. They were all Palestinian. Okay, Arif al-Arif. He was a very important Palestinian. He played a key role in that government. Muhammad Izzat Darwaza, Palestinian from Nablus, played a key role in that government. Go down the line. The head of the police, the gendarmerie, like the head of the police force, patrolling the streets of Damascus during those 2 years, he was also a Palestinian from Nablus. So this was, and by the way, they also had a General Syrian Congress that had a huge Palestinian representation. So it was like a semi-Palestinian government anyways. It was an independent Arab government regardless. Obviously, the British government in Jerusalem was a British colonial government, not just a British colonial government, but one that had promised to transform the country into a Jewish country. So your options are Palestinian, semi-Palestinian government, independent Arab government, semi-democratic government ruled from Damascus, or British colonial government, so colonialism that's going to transform the country into a Jewish country ruled by the British. What would you choose if you were Palestinian?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Well, as well, because of course the ranking, it was America was ranked as well above the British, right? American rule of the country, but that was obviously because, and I guess it links with the colonial kind of thing, because it was the perception, however misguided, especially amongst elites, that America had actually freed itself from British colonialism, a couple of hundred years before, and therefore maybe they would be willing to do the same. And I guess the 14 points by Woodrow Wilson was seemingly some hard evidence of that. And, we've spoken before, it wasn't just the Palestinians who kind of fell for this. Isaac always mentions Ho Chi Minh as well, who
Castro.
was a believer in this. Castro, all of these people who invested their beliefs in America. But I guess that's the very interesting way of seeing it, of like a way out of colonialism through some kind of local powerful Arab ruler.
Well, recall as well that in the aftermath of World War I, Woodrow Wilson gives this infamous 14-point speech in which he calls on that the nations of the world have rights to self-determination. Of course, he's talking about Eastern Europe. He's talking about these territories that are now independent, or in theory could become independent after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But of course, the Arabs are looking at the same Woodrow Wilson speech and saying, "Well, hold on, we're nations too."
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the Palestinian petitions to the British from 1919 really all the way to 1948. They're all saying the same thing. Like, wait a minute, hold on. I thought it's not just Woodrow Wilson, by the way. It's also, you have an Anglo-French declaration in 1918 that says the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. So there are all these European powers and American power saying the same thing. It's like, we support the right to the free peoples of the world to have self-determination. But of course, they don't actually apply that principle in the Middle East. They only apply it in Eastern Europe. And so you get these petitions for decades and decades that fall on deaf ears.
And I guess as well, speaking of the Palestinian national movement, this is kind of a bit of an aside, but actually, no, it's not really. Do you view like a lot of the failure of the early Palestinian national movement as coming from elites and their kind of, their failure to recognize the true gravity of the threat of Zionism?
There's so much to say about what went wrong, or like why there's a Jewish state between the river and the sea and there is no Palestinian state between the river and the sea. The first problem was that I don't think the Palestinian Arabs fully appreciated what they were up against. They were up against a movement whose leaders had the ear of the most powerful empire in the world. I mean, Chaim Weizmann, who was really the leader of the Zionist movement for its first few decades, certainly played a key role in getting the British government in 1917 to adopt the Balfour Declaration, which was sort of the key moment, the key defining moment in the history of Zionism. But for certain, beyond that, I mean, just looking out, the Zionist movement, they were powerful in the United States. They were powerful in the United Kingdom. They were powerful in France. They had an important impact all around Europe. They had emissaries that were sent to Jewish communities all around the world. They had basically every Jewish community around the world by the late 1940s sending the Zionist community money. Were there Palestinians in Chile? And well, there were. Were there Palestinians in the United States and in Europe lobbying those governments to establish a Palestinian state from the 1920s onwards? No, there weren't. So that they were dramatically, I think, like their adversaries had so much more power and so much more influence and so much more money than they did. So that was obviously a huge disadvantage. I mean, look at the history of the leaders of the Zionist movement. They come from the West. I mean, Abba Eban, he comes from South Africa. Golda Meir, she was born in Wisconsin. Ben Gurion, he was born in Poland. Chaim Weizmann, right? Like every single one of these people, every key leader of the Zionist movement from the 1900 to really going well into the 1950s and 60s even, they were born in the imperial capitals around the world. It just wasn't the case with the Palestinian leadership, right? They were just totally outgunned and outmatched. That's one thing. The other problem was that the British in Palestine did everything they could to empower the Jewish community and disempower and divide the Palestinian community, which meant so you had a Jewish agency, right? This was the equivalent of the government of the state of Israel before 1948. The Jewish agency executive became the government of Israel after 1948. And that body, that Jewish agency executive, worked closely with the British. Right? Yeah. It was a sanctioned official Zionist institution in Palestine. Let me ask you a question. What was the equivalent on the Palestinian side? I will answer the question for you. There was no equivalent institution because the British did everything in their power to, it's called a divide and conquer is what historians call this phenomenon, right? They don't want a united Palestinian Arab political leadership. No, they didn't want that. So what they did was instead they created a Supreme Muslim Council. SMC is how it gets the acronym in the literature. So they created this Muslim institution, and they created not one, but multiple Christian institutions. By the way, they had their own. The Palestinian Catholic institutions had their own institutions. So did the Orthodox, so did the Protestant, and so on. But basically, there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So that was one way in which the British sought to divide and conquer the Palestinians, deny them the right to an institution that could serve as a kind of a national leadership institution. Obviously, they did the same with land purchases. So they made it much easier for Zionists to buy up land. They did this by annulling that communal land structure that had existed in Palestine for many, many centuries, known as Musha land, in which Palestinian villages owned land communally. And when you own land communally, it's much less likely for that land to get sold to the Zionist movement than when it's just a single person who owns the land, right? You're going to tell me you're going to convince a whole village of 300 people to sell their land, become landless, lose their means of livelihood. That's not going to happen. But of course, you can convince an absentee landlord to sell that land. So the British, they not only changed all the land laws, by the way, they also granted all of the major concessions in Palestine to the Zionist movement, right? The electricity concession, the sulfur concession, the salt concession, right? All these big concessions, they went to the Jews, not the Palestinians. We could go on and on and on. They kneecapped Palestinian education. They prevented the establishment of a Palestinian university because who becomes a nationalist leader? Someone who's educated and has a higher education. So we could go on and on and on. But this is the nature this is what the Palestinians were facing. They were facing this incredibly well-organized, incredibly powerful, and well-funded Zionist movement. They were facing the most powerful empire in the world that was trying to destroy their national movement. And then yet, I guess, of course, they had plenty of internal divisions within Palestinian society as well, which we could get into as well. But I think it's important to emphasize both the power, the money, and the influence of the two primary challenges that they faced, which was the British and the Zionists.
My understanding is also that the Great Arab Revolts, the 36 to 39 revolts, the way that the British cracked down on those also, I guess, kneecapped the Palestinians' ability to resist militarily.
I mean, we didn't even say the most important thing the British did to empower the Zionists, which was during that revolt from 1936 to 1939, in which landless, impoverished Palestinians who had been pushed off their land owing to Zionist land purchases, they rose up in one of the most significant anti-colonial revolts in all of colonial history. And guess who the British armed and uniformed and trained during that revolt to buttress the British colonial forces? Well, they armed and they trained and they uniformed the Haganah, which was the Zionist paramilitary force. They, of course, didn't do it directly. They just did it indirectly. All these Haganah fighters joined the British police. But that's how the Haganah became such a powerful fighting force. And what did they do to the Palestinians? They did the opposite, right? They trained, uniformed, and armed the Zionist forces while they destroyed, they killed, they imprisoned, they completely demolished the Palestinian irregular fighting forces of Abdul Qadir al-Hussein, and of course of the most famous of all Palestinian resistance leaders, Qassam, which the Qassam brigades of Hamas took its name. He was killed in 1935. Qassam Izz-ad-Din was killed in 1935. But you're absolutely correct. The British forces completely obliterated, decimated the Palestinian guerrilla forces from 1936 to 1939.
It's so interesting, too, because even today, like, you'll hear Zionists make the opposite claim. They'll say, no, actually, the British were colonial in their relation to the Jews.
It's a decolonial revolt.
Yeah, or the Irgun. The Irgun was right to commit terrorism acts against the British because the British were colonial occupiers, things like this. I'm like, well, dude.
So if your point of view is that the British should have not just rejected the political will of the indigenous population of Palestine, but it should have done everything in their power to ensure and guarantee every single Jew in the world should be able to migrate to Palestine, and every Palestinian in the world should be pushed off his or her land to make space for those Jews. If that was your view, then yes, you might argue that the British, right, they limited Zionist immigration from 1940 to 1940. They only allowed in 75,000 Jews into Palestine from 1940 to 1945. In 1936, they only allowed in 70,000 Jews. In 1935, they only allowed in 60,000 Jews into Palestine. Yeah, those evil British colonizers, they didn't allow the Jews to migrate without any restrictions, right? So from the point of view of kind of a Jewish supremacist, that Jews should make all the rules in Palestine and Palestinians should be subject to that Jewish rule, then yes, I suppose, yes, in that world, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, as well, I was thinking that whole time, specifically it's Ord Wingate, right? Who plays like a big role in teaching and setting up Jewish militias during the 36 to 39 revolt. And in my understanding, I read an article that was from 2017. They were talking about how he influenced the founding of Israeli special operations that were created in, when the state's actually founded, and how quite a lot of the worst people to come out of Israel, and in fact, one of the most horrifying and repugnant figures, Ariel Sharon, really cut his teeth there, and how the British really influenced and British really influenced some of the most repugnant policies, detentions,
right. I mean,
blowing up houses, things like that.
If you look at the military rule that Israel applied onto the Palestinians from 1948, when it was established, until 1966, when it lifted that military rule, what you're going to find is that all of those military regulations come from British military regulations that were applied to the Palestinians. And there's dozens of these laws, right? What it ultimately comes down to is collective punishment, right? It's we don't actually care what you did, but what we're trying to do is prevent armed resistance from someone who shares the same ethnicity as you. So we're going to punish you. That is, I think, a good summary of the entirety of colonial rule, right? It's, I don't care if you did anything wrong, but I'm going to destroy your home. I don't care if you did anything wrong, but I'm going to detain you indefinitely, and that your detention is renewable indefinitely, right? All these rules, administrative detention, collective punishment, mass arrest, where they just go into a town and arrest all the men, right? All these policies of collective punishment and mass arrests and indefinite detention and mass slaughter, of course. All these policies are inherited from the British.
Yeah, because I guess that's the kind of interesting aspect of this. You see now, it's actually kind of a funny aspect of British nationalism that I always think about as a British person. There's a whole current amongst right-wingers to kind of venerate and love Israel because, they associate Palestine with something that's been brought over by immigrants. But it's kind of funny because it was sold to the British, in my understanding, as a jewel in the imperial crown. And then the kind of resistance that they experienced from Zionists, and also because of how difficult and how much money was spent repressing the revolt, it was one of the factors in, the decline of the British Empire as well. The losses in Palestine, right?
You may know more about what ultimately led to the decline of the British Empire. I mean, I think World War II played a key role in that.
Yeah, of course.
But obviously, all of these imperial possessions, they just really make no sense in a world where the British Empire is losing control of India. What sense does it make to hold on to Palestine? I mean, recall that Palestine was first occupied by the British because it was located on the eastern flank of the Suez Canal, that vital waterway that connected the motherland to the crown jewel in the empire, enabling the British to be able to ship raw materials from India through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean to the British motherland. And they wanted Palestine to be able to control both flanks of the Suez Canal. They also wanted Palestine to be able to ship oil from the Arabian Persian Gulf by land, from basically the Persian Gulf to Haifa. They had a big oil refinery in Haifa, and that became a key export really already as early as 1913, when the British Army shifted from whatever it was to petroleum. What was
coal,
it? I think
coal.
Coal. Thank you. Yeah, they shifted from coal to petroleum in 1913, right? Just before World War I, just before the Balfour Declaration, as they realized, as they realized they needed a lot of petroleum, and that and when a lot of that petroleum had dried up during the war, those sources, the British petroleum that they were digging out of the ground in Iran, became critical, and the easiest way to bring that to Britain at that time, at least, was overland to Palestine. So in any case, that became critical as well. And of course, this was an age of empire, right? The British were in competition with the French and the Russians for global domination. And so the name of the game was control as much of planet Earth as you can. Palestine is part of planet Earth. So that was probably the third reason the British wanted it. And there were others as well. But you could say those were the key reasons. And you're absolutely right. All of those reasons increasingly went away when the British Empire itself was going away.
There's it is a bit of a jump forward, and I definitely do want to talk about more history. But there is kind of an interesting analogy in something you said to now, and I think it especially showed during the Iran war, of America's foreign policy, especially towards the Middle East, increasingly makes less and less sense, because obviously it's incredibly clear that the Gulf is the economic power center of the Middle East, that the Gulf nations, particularly the United Arab Emirates, are the very important country. And yet the US decided to provoke a war with Iran that was always going to most negatively impact the economies of the Gulf nations. And they did it to protect Israel. They stripped other allies of THAAD batteries, which had already damaged, it was a difficult thing for South Korea to take them because it damaged their relations with their Asian allies. And you kind of look at this of this sort of maybe madness of Britain clinging on to it for too long. And you see it once again repeating kind of with America. And I don't know how you've viewed the recent Iran-US war, but I kind of see it as I don't know, there's something. It's difficult to explain and understand the American relationship with Israel simply.
Yes, I obviously agree with you. If you really boil down to what if you ask yourself, what are the United States' interests in the Middle East circa 2026? Or let's say on February 27th, now we have slightly different interests, which involve opening up a waterway that was previously opening. But let's just go back to February 27th. What is the United States' interest in the Middle East? What do we need from the Middle East? The only thing we can be certain of is we want to be best friends with Iran. I mean, that's basically the only thing we should care about.
Yeah.
We should. In fact, if you actually look at American policy, it's quite literally the exact opposite of that. We've been doing everything to antagonize Iran, when actually they're the only real power in the Middle East that matters. Yeah. They control the only waterway in the Middle East that matters. Maybe with and then the other powers we should be very close with would be Yemen, would be the Houthis, Ansar Allah. That would be the second important power to be an ally with, because they're in control of Bab el-Mandeb, the second most important waterway in the Middle East, which is the Red Sea. How you transit through the Suez Canal. So those are the only two things we need to make sure so we want to be best friends with Iran and best friends with the Houthis. It turns out we're actually worst enemies with both of them. So, but again, there's no logical or rational reason why we're an ally with Israel. Obviously there's a lot of history to that relationship, which we could get into that. But no, I mean, rationally, logically, what is in United States interests? It would obviously not be supporting Israel. If anything, you would be actually being very hostile to Israel, because Israel is hostile to the two powers we need to be good friends with.
I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a bunch of Zionists on Twitter saying, Israel really needs to cut off the states. I don't know if you guys saw that. They're they got to go independent. They got to cut off this relationship with America. It's holding them back.
It's not just American Zionists, right? It's actually Israeli leaders themselves are saying similar things.
Yeah, I don't know what they think they're going to do.
It's a kind of arrogance meets genocidal arrogance meets. I sort of always like to say Zionism kills your brain cells, because it forces you to believe in things that are nonsense. Just to give you, and I do think that it really does make you stupid, because the more you get deep into Zionism, the more ridiculously stupid things you have to accept as true.
Yeah.
And so it really does make you stupid, including this belief that you should cut off the United States. Like, it does make you stupid. It actually kills your brain cells. Like, that's not a joke. Like, you actually have fewer brain cells because it forces you, because the more shit you believe that's stupid, the more stupider you become.
Well, the only person who tried it right was Begin. Begin called Reagan and said, we're going to attack Beirut anyway, if I remember correctly. I think Seth Anziska wrote about this. He talks about over Beirut in 1982. He calls Ronald Reagan and he says, well, we don't need you. And then 20 minutes later, he calls him back and he says, yeah, sorry about that. I think he actually says the famous quote of I am not a Jew with trembling knees, or I know it's the quote comes before that, but I think that I feel like Seth Anziska says that happens. But yeah, it doesn't really feel real. And when you read more, I don't know, I'll read the Financial Times and whatever to find stuff out. I think it was they had an article about the engagement of, the engagement with missiles, and apparently America did the vast majority of it. It may not have even been the Financial Times. I can't remember who it was, but they reported about how the Americans had engaged twice as many missiles, Iranian actual missiles. They'd fired twice as many interceptors as the Israelis, and the Israelis had largely been shooting down far less complex Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthi projectiles. And the only thing that can deal with Iranian missiles are very expensive, very time-consuming missile interceptors made by Americans. And yet you watch this, you watch Haviv Rettig Gur writing these long-ass whiny pieces about why Israel's ready to cut off America.
Dude, don't get me started on that guy. I mean, I think Haviv ranks number one in the world in the following: using the most number of words to say the least.
I might disagree with you. I think Adam Louis Klein takes that.
Fair enough. You got me. This guy will write a book and I'll read it 6 times because I'm just I can't understand what he's saying. And then after I think I finally understand what he's saying, I'm like, he's not saying anything at all. He just took 800 words to say nothing. And I'm like, how did you use that many words to say so little? And it's just and then he has this. Sorry, this is a tangent. There's no reason to be wasting time on this.
It's enjoyable.
I take pride in writing because writing well is very important. Because if you want to convince someone of something, you have to use compelling language. You have to be concise. You have to be precise. You have to be tight. You have to be to the point. And so if you're the opposite of those things, you're just a bad communicator. I don't know how you became such a famous Hasbaraist. I don't know how if you ask Israel, pro-Israel people that who they will point to Haviv as one of the most reasonable, one of the most effective communicators, one of the most brilliant Hasbara people around. That's how he's portrayed by Hasbaraist. It's quite remarkable. I mean, this is the best they've got.
Douglas Murray is perhaps the one who interests me the most. Obviously, he's British, but he got some award for being a great defender of Israel, given to him by Isaac Herzog, I think. And his new book is just littered with inaccuracies. Some of the, this guy's an academic. He produced a book about one of Lord Byron's friends at the age of 18. He's actually really talented, at least in some aspects, but he just cites all of the Hamas leaders are billionaires. And his citation is the New York Post. And there's no evidence to it. It's just something that you say. And you talk about this thing of losing brain cells. And I guess this was something that I was trying to get at earlier when we were talking about, what it's like going from academia to doing this on the internet. Because, you think about talking about the British occupation of Mandatory Palestine. The fact that you actually have to communicate with someone who is of the belief that the Jewish people were oppressed by the British when avowed Zionists like Herbert Samuel were appointed is truly remarkable, because Herbert Samuel was not just Jewish, he was a Zionist.
So you have to believe, if you're a Zionist, you have to believe that the 2,000-year right of return is infinitely more just. That is, the 2,000-year Jewish right of return is infinitely more just and more reasonable and more moral than a 2-generation right of return. So you have to believe that. You have to believe that what is Zionism? It's basically Jewish immigration to Palestine, right? So you have to believe that immigration is actually indigeneity, right? Because Jews are telling you that, Jews are Zionists want to convince you that, Jews are indigenous to Palestine. But then, of course, Zionism is all about where Jews moved to Palestine. They immigrated to Palestine, they colonized Palestine. But you have to believe that actually immigration and colonization is actually indigeneity, right? Here's another thing you have to believe. So Zionists want you to believe that, Zionism is all about self-determination. And it's all about liberation, right? Jews are liberating themselves. But in order to establish a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country, the key is not self-determination or liberation, it's actually expulsion. What you have to do is expel the people living there. That's how to create a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. So that you have to believe that liberation is actually expulsion. So you have to believe that, like, all people, like, you have to believe that Jews, Muslims, and Christians should be treated equally in whatever country you live, because you probably live in the United States or the UK or Germany, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians have equal rights. So then you have to believe that in Israel they shouldn't have equal rights. So what you believe to be true for yourself, you have to believe should not be true for others. What you want for yourself should not be what you want for others. So, like, violating the cardinal principle of the most universal principle on earth, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You have to reject that. So it's like you have to just believe thing after thing after thing that just makes no sense at all.
Yeah, it does. It does ask of you to kind of twist into pretzels trying to defend an ideology that you wouldn't apply in your own country. If you're like a Westerner, you would never say that these principles should hold true here.
If Jews weren't allowed to buy land specifically in parts of Canada, and there was like a para-state institution like the Jewish National Fund that called buying land from Palestinians and expelling them, redeeming it, and they did that with, I don't know, white people buying land from non-white people and calling that redeeming it, everyone would be like, holy shit, that is incredibly racist. That is incredibly bigoted.
Even more explicitly, you just look at the 2018 nation state law. It just says it. It just says it in the letter of the law. Yeah, this self-determination, that's a right exclusive for Jewish people. So, I don't know. While we're on this segment, and I'm being cognizant of the time that we have, did you want to get into the lies about the Nakba segment, since we're talking about how Zionism kind of scrambles your brain and the need to correct those narratives? I guess this would be a good...
The only one thing I wanted to note, or to ask you kind of a tiny bit about, Zach, is... and this is just one point from the thing, is kind of the myth of eternal persecution that Zionism sort of has as a beginning of the name change allegedly inflicted on Judea to Syria, Palestina as a punishment. And you kind of, you query that, right? In your work, you don't believe, there's no proof of it, right?
Yeah, so the first thing to ask yourself here is, why do Zionists care about Roman administrative nomenclature in the 2nd century CE? Okay? Do they care about other aspects of Roman history? Do they care about like administrative nomenclature in Byzantine history or Umayyad history? Or no, they don't. So about 50 years ago, Bernard Lewis in 1975 writes this magnum opus in Commentary Magazine. And as far as I can tell, this is really the first time where this theory is ever proposed. And he makes this claim that gets accepted as fact ever since, that in 135 CE, when the Roman Emperor Hadrian, when he crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt, he vengefully replaced the name Judea, which was the name that was used at the time to describe the region. He replaced it with Palestina. Now, the first thing to say here is actually didn't replace it with Palestina. He replaced it with Syria Palestina, Syrian Palestine. So already, like, and the reason he did that, they claim, is out of vengeance and to spite the Jews, right? So Zionists love this episode, or they say they love to recite this story because for them it's inevitable. It's divine proof of the 2,000-year history of the uninterrupted, unremitting persecution of the Jews. Right. So, but the first problem with the story is that there's no actual evidence to believe it's true. We don't know that there was a name change. There's zero evidence that there was ever even an imperial decree issued by the Roman Emperor Hadrian himself at all. It could have just been a case of dynamic evolution. One name fell out of use and another name superseded it. And by the way, there's a lot of reason to believe that theory is true, the theory of dynamic evolution, because there are many, many writers long after the ostensible name change took place talking and referring to this place as Judea, not Palestina, or not Syria, Palestina. So it's like, wouldn't that be spitting in the face of Rome if Rome had eventually erased it, including, by the way, official inscriptions? So like, that makes no sense. Also, by the way, let's just suppose the theory is true. Let's suppose the Zionist theory is true, that Hadrian actually that he changed the name, that it was an imperial decree. Well, it could have been for any number of reasons, right? It could have been because Hadrian was obsessed with Greek culture and he loved, and by the way, he changed multiple other cities in the Roman Empire to their erstwhile Greek names. He brought back all kinds of Greek institutions. He introduced Greek culture to the Roman Empire, right? So he was obsessed with Greece. Maybe that's why. So, and by the way, so it's like, we don't know there was an imperial decree. Even if there was, it could have been for a different reason. All of this is just to say that there's no evidence, there's no compelling evidence that this story is correct. It just serves a narrative. It serves a narrative that says Jews face uninterrupted, unremitting, forever persecution, which is, of course, not true. Jews have actually enjoyed long periods in which they were well accepted in society for hundreds and hundreds of years. During the Ottoman Empire, Jews were integrated into Arab and Muslim societies. They occupied important positions in the Arab and Muslim societies that they were a part of. They did not know what anti-Semitism was. It would have been a foreign concept to them. They wouldn't have understood what you were even talking about. So it's a myth. It's a myth to serve a narrative, is what it is.
The funniest part about that myth is sometimes it's usually coupled with the claim that not only did the Romans change the name to spite the Jews, but then in there is when the Romans actually created the name Palestine. And that's the one that's really funny, because it's been my understanding, and I've read this in Norma Zala's book, the aforementioned Palestine, a 4,000 year history, where I was always under the impression that Palestine was already a name used to describe that region and the people from it, and then the Romans elevated a pre-existing title to an administrative role, and like they meshed together some provinces. That was kind of my understanding. But it's really interesting to hear you say all of this and say there's no proof of a decree. We don't know anything about this. So
is a lot of this history because of when it was written, because of who it comes from? Because, you mentioned in here, maybe if we got the history of the Philistines talking about themselves, we'd have different perspectives on all of this. Is this history just ultimately so incredibly shaky that it's often quite difficult to make the kind of pronouncement that is, yeah, they did this to just be mean to Jewish people and to exterminate us?
Like, when trying to understand what happened 2,000 years ago, you have to realize, like, the standards of evidence that we have are so dramatically lower than the standards of evidence we would require for something that happened yesterday, right?
Yeah.
So, or even something that happened 100 years ago. I mean, dramatically different. There are no written records that have survived from that time and place. I mean, there may be some Dead Sea Scrolls, right? There may be a few, but in terms of that episode of history, we don't have any written records, right? What we have there's a few things we have. We have inscriptions, which isn't necessarily a written record. It's just like 3 words, right? But then we also have later chronicles that were, maybe the first like textual, physical version of that chronicle exists in a copyist's version 300, 500, 600 years later. So we just don't have, and actually in the case of 135C, we're talking about, you may not have a copyist of anything that happened. I mean, how do we even know the Bar Kokhba revolt happened, right? It was because of probably, we know because you have, these chronicles that were written centuries later. Like the earliest version of a chronicle we have describing anything that happened in 135C will date to centuries later. So the standards of evidence are so much lower. We have no evidence whatsoever that Hadrian said anything at all. I don't know I can't prove to you Hadrian said anything. I can't prove to you Hadrian wrote anything. I have no idea what Hadrian thought, what he believed. It's all trying to piece together a narrative based on very limited shards of evidence that are themselves narratives constructed hundreds of years later.
Yeah, because I contend a lot with like these myths and these national, these nation building myths to justify Israel. And I guess what you just said kind of holds true for a lot of the myths, right? Like the Roman expulsion, the supposed Roman expulsion after the destruction of the Second Temple. From my understanding, the Romans didn't actually have an expulsion policy, and I don't know how exactly you prove that. Even like the United Monarchy, David and Solomon, like. Do we know for certain? I've heard like there's Israel Finkelstein is a guy, he's like an archaeologist who has a book, it's called The Bible Unearthed, where he contests this theory. He says, no, David and Solomon were probably more like hill chieftains, and they had kind of like little, pockets of power, but...
Yeah. Look, there's no independent evidence that a character named Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or King David, there's no independent evidence that any of these figures existed outside the Bible.
Yeah.
So like historically, if you think of like how the Bible was interpreted, right? So up until the 19th century, the Bible was the word of God. And then what happened was in the 19th century, you got these people who said, actually, no, this is just a book written by human beings. And what we need to do is we need to look at all the other evidence, the archaeological evidence, other textual sources, the Assyrian records, the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and we have to assume everything's false unless there's corroborating evidence otherwise. And so you have these different schools of thought. So that's another, and then you had another sort of approach to the Bible, which was a more literary approach, which said, let's try and deconstruct this text. And so then they break down the Bible itself and say, this sentence comes from the J source. This sentence uses a different word to refer to God as the J source. We're going to call that the P source. And so then they say, the Bible, the text itself, the 5 books of Moses, was actually 4 previous texts that were intertwined by a single redactor. Right? So that's a popular hypothesis. Right? So there were these different approaches to try and understand the Bible. Once you come to the realization that it's not a divine text, that it's actually written by humans, like all other texts we know of. And once you make that assumption, then everything changes. But you're right, there's no independent evidence at all that any of these figures in the Bible even existed at all.
Yeah.
Which kind of feels like a crazy thing then to base all of your politics around, and the belief that you have a right to that you have a right to displace huge amounts of people, and that will be permanently just and moral.
Well, fortunately, international law is guided by principles like, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and, these types of things, rather than being based on the argument that if a group of people dig deep enough into the ground and find ruins into the ground that they believe, or at least they claim to believe, were their great ancestors 3,000 years ago, then they have a right to commit genocide against the people that were living on that land.
Yeah.
Fortunately,
exactly.
International law doesn't work that way.
Quick question, Chris. Do you want to just get right into like lies about the Nakba, and we could save the Arab conquest mythology for later, maybe?
Yeah, I think it kind of probably makes sense to go from, what comprises Israel's ancient history to myths about the Nakba. And I think the first of these that I do not even know who has cooked this up, because it is a new, this is some new Zionist propaganda. Have you ever heard the claim that actually all of the Palestinians, or all of the people who termed themselves Palestinians, were actually immigrants who came because of all of the great things that Jewish people had done in Palestine?
Yes, that's right. So in the 1980s, a person by the name of Joanne Peters published a book called From Time Immemorial. And this book, when it was first published, was reviewed in the New York Times and a bunch of other very prominent publications, and it was reviewed very favorably. And her main argument was what you just said, right? That most of the people who would later be calling themselves Palestinians had actually migrated from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt to Palestine after Zionist immigration, owing to all of these new job opportunities and work opportunities that were created by the Zionists. So that's the narrative, or that's the argument she makes. Now, the problem with our book is that she falsified evidence. It's a fraudulent piece of scholarship. So
that's
Norman Finkel.
I was just going to say, that's the one that Finkelstein as a student kind of dissected, right?
That's right. So when Norman Finkelstein was a PhD student, I guess roughly around this time, he picks up this book and basically goes through it like line by line, footnote by footnote. And he writes a takedown of that book that effectively debunks the entirety of the argument, because what he does is time and time again show that she literally makes up evidence. She just invented, like, here's the thing about history writing. It's uncommon that people actually go into the footnotes and like fact check historians. Very rarely. It almost never happens. So it's actually pretty easy for historians to make shit up. She probably never thought she'd get caught. But the problem was her argument was just so ridiculous. No one had ever argued that before, because that's not what happened. There's no evidence to believe that happened at any significant scale. And so it was just so weird. So he goes in and he goes to the footnotes and just discovers she's just making stuff up.
It's
like
so crazy.
inventing data. And by the way, it wasn't just Norm. Yehoshua Porth does the same thing. Yehoshua Porth, I would describe as perhaps the most important historian of the history of the Palestinian national movement from 1920 to 1948. He's an Israeli historian who wrote a series of books on it in the 1970s. Brilliant historian. He reviews the book and comes to the exact same conclusion that Norm did. So, and multiple other scholars as well. So anyone who have looked at that a book has determined it's a fraud. It's not a serious argument, but yet it's still cited by Zionists today.
Yeah, and they'll cite it specifically to claim that, well, look, the Palestinians are also, well, they won't say also, but they'll say the Palestinians are not indigenous because they moved here. But my understanding is indigeneity, as per the UN working definition of it, indigeneity is defined via colonialism. It's defined through having a dynamic of colonialism applied to you. So even if this was true, which it's not, we've been over it's not, but even if it was true, and say Arabs moved to Palestine and joined the existing polity and then still faced colonization and strived to keep that existing polity alive in the face of said colonization, it would still meet the eligibility for indigeneity under the UN working definition. So wouldn't it be like a bunk point regardless?
When it comes to trying to understand where Zionist propaganda comes from or why certain points of propaganda are chosen and preferred over others, you cannot try and make sense out of this. You can't use reason and logic to try and understand where this stuff comes from. It's just whatever they think will make them appear moral and just and superior, and whatever will make Palestinians appear inferior or less indigenous. But you're obviously correct.
It's sort of, I guess it segues really well into lies about the Nakba, which is kind of the next section we wanted to talk about, because obviously settler colonial theory mixed with kind of historiography of the Nakba has been so injurious to the Zionist project, in the sense of it kind of creates this through line from, in fact, pre-Nakba as well, but colonization of Palestine as a kind of genocidal mode of destruction of the indigenous population, which has so evidently, especially post-October the 7th, become so mainstream to talk about Zionism as this, not just like a problem. Well, actually, it's the major problem for people like Bernie Sanders. They want it to be a project that's gone awry, whereas this kind of settler colonial theory understanding and a proper contextualization of the Nakba produces the exact opposite of that the project was always destined for this.
Yes, I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought just as you were talking. So if you could just kind of repeat the question, that would be helpful. Thank you. I'm sorry.
It's my fault as well. I guess the kind of question is like, how what do you make of sort of like Zionist responses to pretending that this wasn't colonialism, that it was not always destined to be this genocidal project?
Well, I think the first thing to say about Zionism and colonialism is that the Zionist movement itself described itself as a colonial movement. You had the Jewish Colonial Trust, which sought to buy up land in Palestine. You had the Jewish Colonization Association, the JCA. You had the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association. There were a bunch of them. It wasn't just one. And the reason was because there was nothing wrong with colonialism in their minds, right? We have this taboo against describing something as colonial because we think it's wrong that one group of people who thinks they're morally, culturally, intellectually superior to another group of people would have the right to go and move to that country and control those people. We think that's immoral, but they didn't think that in 1880 or 1890 or 1900. And that's why they use the word colonial and the word colonialization, because they were bringing civilization and progress to a group of people they perceived to be backwards. So why would they not want to do that? I mean, so that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that Arthur Rupin, who was you could say he was the Ben Gurion before Ben Gurion. He was the leader of the Palestine office in Jaffa in the 1910s, and from and even into the 1920s. And one of his first hires in that Palestine office was a former official who belonged to the German Colonization Association, who had worked in the office trying to transform a part of Poland known as Poznan from a Polish demographic majority to a German demographic majority. And Arthur Rupin was like, oh, this guy's perfect. We're trying to do the same thing in Palestine. We're trying to transform Palestine from Arab to Jewish, just like the Germans are trying to transform Poland from Polish to German. This guy will be perfect. So, and then, I mean, if you just look at the statements of Chaim Weizmann, if you look at the statements of Israel Zangwill, if you look at the statements of Ben Gurion, they talk about how we're going to make Palestine as English as England is English.
Yeah. You know, also Herzl's the Jewish state, rampart of Europe against barbarity or whatever of Asia. Also the Iron Wall. But Jabotinsky says we're doing colonization. The Arabs are actually responding rationally. Now we just got to get super strong until we can negotiate from a position of strength.
Thank you for adding those two great examples to that laundry list of examples, which all point in the same direction, which is that the Zionist movement saw itself as a colonial movement, defined itself as doing colonialism, named its institutions after using the word colonialism because they were doing colonialism.
Well, another one's kind of like a real kicker, was Herzl penned a letter to Cecil Rhodes, and he said, I need your help because what I'm doing is, quote, something colonial. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to not. But yeah, like, whenever I bring this up to Zionists that I'll be bickering with, they'll say, well, colonialism didn't have a bad connotation yet. So that's kind of what they argue. But then my response is like, okay, well, what year can you say that the negative connotation came? Like, because from the perspective of its victims, obviously it was always negative. But the Biltmore Conference of 1942, you see Zionists saying, we just built we wrote a notable page in the history of colonization. Can you really say that by 1942? 1942, like, we don't know that this shit's bad?
The other thing to say here is that leaving aside the naming and the quotes, what did the Zionist movement actually do?
Yeah.
And how does that compare to other types of movements? Now, what they did was the plan was to move to Palestine and buy up land in Palestine and evict the people living on that land because they weren't Jewish. What did whites do in South Africa or the United States or Canada or Zimbabwe? Or what did the Spanish colonizers do in Mexico and Venezuela and Colombia and Peru? And what did the Dutch colonizers do in Indonesia? I mean, they did the same thing. They bought up, they actually didn't buy up land. They just killed the natives. But the Zionists, they were moving to a place that was already in control by another empire, the Ottoman Empire, so they couldn't just kill people.
Yeah.
They had to actually buy the land.
Conquest of the labor market and stuff, complete expulsion, economic subjugation.
Exactly. So it's to build so the goal wasn't to like integrate into the local Palestinian Arab society and learn Palestinian Arabic and move into Palestinian Arab villages and go to Palestinian Arab schools and work for Palestinian Arab businesses. No.
Right.
The plan was to build Jewish-only colonies and run a Jewish-only labor union and buy up land exclusively for Jews and build Jewish-only schools and build a Jewish-only workforce to create a state in which Jews would be the supermajority and Jews would occupy all the important political, economic, diplomatic positions in society. That was the goal. That's called colonialism.
And that's what the distinguishing factor is, right? Because theoretically, there's nothing wrong with immigration or seeking like somewhere to find refuge. That's not a problem if they were to go and like seek refuge among the existing polity. But it's the explicit desire to replace that polity. And I mean, Patrick Wolf says that, well, with the logic of elimination, eliminating the old society.
That's right. Patrick Wolf wrote a very famous essay called, I think it's called The Logic of Settler Colonialism, in which he says,
elimination. I think
Yeah. Thank you. In which he argues that every settler colonial movement has the same logic. They always lead to the same thing. There's no exceptions here. They always lead to the elimination of the native, because the native ideally wouldn't have been there in the first place. I mean, ideally, this would have been a land for a people without a land, right? I mean, ideally, according to the Zionist imagination, there were no people there. And so you show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. That's exactly how all settler colonial movements work. It's not to integrate. It's to yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
The essay is called "Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native." Sorry. Just in case anyone wanted to look it up.
And that was the case wherever you had settler colonial movements. Zionism was actually, according to one scholar, was an ideal type of settler colonial movement in the Weberian understanding of ideal types, in the sense that the difference between a settler colonial movement and a colonial movement was that the settler colonial movements, they wanted to sever their connections to their motherlands. It was, we're not going back. We're done with the motherland, right? Whereas you had a lot of colonial movements, even like the American colonists, they actually didn't want to initially sever the connection. They wanted to maintain a connection to the motherland. And so in that sense, the Zionists were actually like, it's not to say they didn't go back. Actually, many of them did, because the enterprise, at least initially, was flailing. And many of the initial Zionist colonies in Palestine failed, and they got malaria, and a majority of the settlements from 1880 to 1914 failed, and most of them went back to Europe. But leaving that aside, at least in their imagination, it was, we're done with Europe. We're never going back, which kind of makes it a typical and an ideal type of settler colonial movement.
It's kind of crazy that when you mentioned, I never knew the thing about, this is going quite far back, but Ruppin and the German figure who was effectively obsessed with what Hitler would crystallize into his vision of Lebensraum, taking the land in Eastern Europe because Germany needed it. Germany needed it to develop and become this perfect nation that he dreamed of. And it's kind of funny, I was watching some reel of this, a moronic Zionist and a big fan of the Shah and stuff, and they were like, you have to understand the Palestine movement because of Haj Amin al-Husseini is keeping the Nazis alive, and the Iranians do it too now. And you actually look and you talk about this, and I've been reading Ian Kershaw's biography of Hitler, and the way he talks about him, Hitler, especially in coming to power, he of course was always a deranged anti-Semite, but he did also speak constantly of Lebensraum. It wasn't just like a bit of his ideology. He obsessed with it. And, you kind of situate it, you kind of talk about Zionism with where it belongs in these other colonies, and the fact that there are actually Lebensraum seemingly adherents involved in the Zionist project. Even if they weren't, it wouldn't change anything. But you see what this really is. And I guess that was the point I was getting at earlier. There's no real address to settler colonial theory, right? Because it's so injurious to see Zionism for what it is.
Yeah, exactly. I think the Zionist movement will, I think once they accept settler colonialism, what they'll try and oftentimes do is tell you, well, there's no, again, the United States was a settler colonial project as well, right? And here I am, an American citizen. It's not like I'm trying to sort of bring about a destruction of the United States. I mean, I would say there's a few key differences, by the way. Look, the case with the United States is that the genocide was effectively successful.
Yeah.
They eradicated the overwhelming majority of the indigenous population to such an extent that they could not reconstitute themselves as a viable political force. That's just obviously not the case with Zionism. It came 300 years later. And so the colonization process was incomplete, and the genocide was incomplete. And so, but they're still trying, right? It's like in the United States, at least they sort of realized, okay, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have done this. We're going to try and make reparations. We'll give the indigenous people more autonomy, more sovereignty. They can even establish their own foreign policy with other countries if they want in their own reservations, right? They can establish. They have their own. They can make their own rules within their own reservations, right? There's been some attempt to not just compensate, but also to stop the criminal acts against them. It's not to say there isn't a whole lot of more work still to do, but they've at least stopped the criminal acts for the most part. Whereas in the case of Israel and Palestine, it's not just that the colonization is continuing, but the genocide is continuing. Like it's like go back to 1820 America, where you have a Trail of Tears and when you have a genocide ongoing, or you have the natives just being on the frontier just being slaughtered indiscriminately. I mean, go back 200 years. That's where Israel-Palestine is today.
Yeah, I actually think in that Wolf essay, he quotes someone who was involved in the Civil War who was like, oh, I saw bloody battles and I saw horrendous things during that. But he's like, I don't think it was anything like what was done to the natives. Like, there's just barbaric cruelty. And you know what? Like, I know that there are plenty of other grotesque wars inflicted by the American empire, but what the Israelis currently are doing in Gaza, and the fact that they kind of have this very naked systemic policy of extermination that's occasionally enunciated by Smotrich, occasionally enunciated by Ben-Gvir, where they just say what they're doing. But it doesn't take a genius to see it by looking at what they're doing, denying pesticides into Gaza so rat bites proliferate, denying, housing materials so people live in squalid conditions, denying garbage disposal, denying sewage disposal and like clean toilets and all of these things. It is a really grotesque example of like the most horrifying things that humans can imagine, being stripped of your basic necessities as a policy of extermination that Zionists said they were going to do. Giora Island, I'm sure you remember that statement at the start of the genocide. Epidemics will help us in our goal.
I believe it was Giora Island as well who published an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post going back 2 decades. And I believe the Jerusalem Post has scrubbed this article off its website. You can find the article online. I think it's been screenshotted or it's been reposted. But he said, referring to Gaza, he said in, was it 2002, 2003-ish? He said, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have, or maybe it was actually after disengagement. So it might have been actually around 2005-06 when he said, we're going to, so this is when Israel pulled out its 6,000 illegal Jewish settlers and decided to control Gaza from the outside rather than control it from the inside. It would be less costly. It would be less deadly for our soldiers, be easier to control. And so they pull out the soldiers, and Giora Island in this context said, he basically predicts, he says, in order for us to control Gaza, we're going to have to kill and kill and kill. And just read that 2005 Jerusalem Post op-ed, and it's about as prescient of an article as you'll ever find. And that is exactly what Israel has done for the past 21 years in Gaza.
Yeah. Do you want to, Chris, you want to show him the video now?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got a video of someone. Yeah, I think, no, you say.
We've drove home throughout this conversation the importance of dispelling Zionist narratives and correcting the record, especially when faulty history is spewed out there, especially from people with large platforms who should know better and be more responsible. So we have this, actually, I think he's a historian, right? A Palestinian historian, Chris? Is that what we're dealing with? There is an individual who is very confident speaking about what happened during the Nakba, and he has some pretty wacky theories. So we just kind of wanted to get your raw reaction and see what an actual historian on the subject would have to say about this.
Sure thing.
1948, the War of Independence is called in Israel. Others know it as the Arab-Israeli War. After the partition...
Literally not a mention of Nakba. Nobody... Just those 2 names, guys.
That's it.
To split. After the partition plan to split the Palestine into a part Arab, part Jewish, as many of you probably know, every Arab country around Israel waged a war of annihilation to basically prevent the state from being formed. Mm-hmm. Now, there's different ranges of people, who say like, oh, they were going to kill all the Jews, or I doubt they were probably going to kill everybody, but I think they probably would have made them refugees. Whatever, it doesn't matter. They waged a war of extermination on Israel in 1948. Now, here's the ironic part about this all. At that time, there was 1 million Jews living in the Arab and Muslim world. 1 million. These Jews that live in those countries for 2,000 plus years. Okay? When the war started, then anti-Semitism spiked greatly in in the Arab and the Muslim world. And because of that, pretty much 99.9% of all the Jews in the Middle East were forced to leave their country under threat of violence to go to Israel. So in trying to prevent the state of Israel, they all became anti-Semitic, kicked all the Jews out, 1 million Jews, there was 1 million of them. And then they forced them to move to the only fucking place they could in the entire world, which was Israel.
Okay, so again, I'm not the historian on the panel, but my understanding is that 300,000 Palestinians were already ethnically cleansed before the entrance of a single Arab state's army into Palestine would be number one. And when it came to the civil war prior to that, the event that is typically cited as the start of the civil war would be the November 30 attack on a Jewish bus, which killed 5 to 7 people, right? And the typical Zionist historiography is that the Arabs started that. But what we actually come to know when we look into things a little further, and I think Benny Morris is actually, funnily enough, one of the people who put this forward, was that attack that is typically cited as the start of the civil war in Palestine on November 30th was actually a retaliation for the fact that the Stern Gang murdered an Arab Bedouin clan. So right off the bat, the framing of this as though the Jewish people wanted a peaceful two-state solution or whatever, regardless, like they didn't even abide by the 47 partition plan. They ethnically cleansed Jaffa, but regardless, how do you contend with this? Like, is this too far gone to correct?
Yeah, so much to say here. So first of all, I don't put a lot of weight on this question of like who fired the first shot. I don't know the details of that incident on November 30th. In part because I just don't really think it matters. It's sort of like who fired the first shot and it's like let's just say the Zionist narrative is correct, that actually those 5 or 6 people that were killed were killed by Palestinians. So like you kill 5 people, so now I have a right to ethnically cleanse 750,000. Is that how proportionality works? No, That's not how proportionality works. That would mean that, in theory, if that's correct, again, I don't know if it is, but if it is correct, then, the Zionists would have a right to one counterattack, right? Again, proportionality. That's sort of the nature of war. The two basic rules in warfare are proportionality and no indiscriminate use of force. You can't just indiscriminately attack people. You have to target military targets, and you have to be proportionate in your targeting. So, like, again, it doesn't matter who fired the first shot. So that's the first point. The second point is, yes, you're absolutely correct. Between November 1947 and May 15th, let's say May 14th, 1948, the Zionist forces expelled, you're right, by force about 300,000. Actually, another 100,000 left, and we're obviously not allowed back. The 100,000 would be mostly urban elites from Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem, and the other urban centers in Palestine. In those first 2 to 3 months, November, December, January, February, about 100,000 left, mostly on their own, but also because there was a war, and no one wants to be stuck in a war, so people leave, even if they weren't like attacked directly. They were also ethnically cleansed because they weren't allowed back home after the war. So about 400,000, you're right, were expelled by force long before any Arab army entered Palestine. Now, let's talk about what happened when the Arab armies did enter Palestine. So first of all, there were no calls to for the Palestinians to leave. That's just Zionist mythology.
He actually does push that. He does push that in a different clip. He says the only reason the Palestinians left is because Arab leaders told them to, which is discredited by Benny Morris, by Shlomo Ben-Ami. So he's to the right of both of those people. The
genocidal Zionist historians of the 40 War reject that. So there's no need to take that argument seriously. Yeah. But the other point to make here, I think, that like getting back to this question of like who fired the first shot, you have to recall the November of 47 partition plan. I can't think of a more violent, at least obviously it's a document, but it's discursive. It's an incredible amount of discursive violence in that document, right? Because what the document is saying is that they're about, so the Jewish state would have been roughly 55. The proposal was we're going to partition Palestine. Jews get, they get about 55% of the country. About 55% of the country. Palestinians get about 45% of the country. I think that's Maybe I'm
It's
messing up the numbers.
56%. I think it's 56%, and they made up a third of the population and owned less than 7% of the land.
Exactly. So, but you have to realize within that Jewish state, there was going to be about 40 to 45% of it would have been Palestinian.
Supposed to be, yeah.
And the Zionist movement has been talking about, not just for like a few years, but literally for many decades, they've all agreed that the solution to the quote unquote Arab problem, that's how they called it, i.e. the problem that there are Arabs in Palestine, they had agreed that the solution to that problem was what they call transfer, what you and I today would call forcible expulsion or ethnic cleansing. That solution had been agreed upon in the 1930s. And it had been reaffirmed not just in 1936, 37, 38, but again in 46, 47, and 48, when Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and Yitzhak Ben Zvi and Moshe Sharet and every other, Yosef Weitz and Golda Meir, they all agreed. There was no disagreement. Like, I can't find a single Zionist that disagreed. Like, zero. Like, everyone agreed they had to go. So if you were one of those 45% within of Palestinians in the Jewish state, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, that document basically declared you were going to get expelled from your home by force. It was an incredibly violent document. So,
Yeah.
and that was just the Palestinians that were going to be in the Jewish state. Obviously, there were many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were outside of the contours of the Jewish state, that were supposed to be within the Palestinian state, who were also expelled. Because the Zionists weren't just satisfied with the portion of Palestine that was allotted to them. They wanted the whole thing.
Jaffa was an enclave given to the Arab state by the plan. The village of Deir Yassin was situated in the International Jerusalem Zone, and it had a non-aggression pact with the Haganah. That didn't really save it, so... Yeah.
I mean, here's, I think, a good equivalent. It would be, imagine if the UN came out today and said, we're going to partition Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon. And Israel gets to control all the area south of the Litani River. Actually, they've declared, what's that other one? There's another river of
Chris,
what's that next river?
It begins with
Zaytani?
No,
it's...
I forgot the name of the river.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Suppose the UN said we're gonna give all the land south of the Zaydani River to Israel. And then north of the Zaydani River goes to Lebanon. That would kind of be the equivalent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because but wait, hold on. Like, why should Israel get any land again? Like, how does that make any sense?
There's a little, it's an essay by Walid Khalidi. It's called Revisiting the UNGA Plan. And in it, he also talks about he calls it an economic coup de grace, because he mentions how like 40% of the country's electrical supply was to fall within the envisioned Jewish state, a bunch of the industry. So, and some of the very like fertile plains fell into the Jewish state. So it was just really unfair to request that the people give up on their economic power.
That's exactly right. And just to bring us back to this clip we watched, I think there's a final point that needs addressing, which is this idea that, we already said there were calls for the Palestinians to leave. By the way, there were also no calls to push the Jews into the sea. Yeah, that's also a myth. Shai Chazkani published a book on the topic, 1948 War, and he has a Haaretz article in which he basically says, look, I went looking for these calls. I spent 10 to 15 years scounging around all the books, the articles, the press, all propaganda documents. And he basically says, look, I did find the phrase, we want to push, the Arabs want to push the Jews into the sea. But I found it in the Zionist archives. It was actually Zionist leaders that conveyed that message to Zionist soldiers during the 1948 war to convince them that the Arabs wanted to push the Jews into the sea, even though we can't find any actual Arabs saying that. Right. So that's a myth as well. And then, by the way, when the Zionist movement was in the process of expelling these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians between November 1947 and May 1948, they held secret meetings with the Emir Abdullah of Jordan.
Yeah.
In which, who has
Golda Meir met with him. Golda Meir in 47, they planned to partition the West Bank, and Abdullah said that he would tell the Jordan, or he would restrain the Arab Legion so that
That's right.
They wouldn't.
That's right.
Yeah.
So basically, the Zionists realized the Arab Legion, which is a Transjordanian fighting force run by a British officer named Glub Pasha, it was the fiercest fighting force in the Arab world, much, much fiercer than any of the other Arab armies or militias. And the Zionists neutralized it. They signed an agreement with them that said, you guys can take the West Bank, the area that was supposed to be a Palestinian state. You guys take that. I mean, the Zionists were obsessed with no Palestinian state. That was the only thing they needed to ensure. They didn't care about anything else. They almost didn't even care how much land they took over. Ben-Gurion was laserly obsessed with one thing during that war. I mean, aside from expelling the Palestinians, which was necessary to create a Jewish majority within the Jewish state. But the second thing he was obsessed with was making sure no Palestinian state came into existence. It's been the singular Zionist obsession for 78 years and counting. Never sure there'll be a Palestinian state. I mean, we could spend hours just talking about that one question, but that was Ben-Gurion's view in 48. And so he made the deal with the Transjordanian emir, I believe his name was Abdullah. Abdullah takes over, King Abdullah takes over the West Bank, what became the West Bank in 48. And so there was about a month, the invading Arab armies, they were going to push the Jews into the sea. That point of propaganda refers to it's about 3 to 4 weeks in which the Zionists actually had to fight a war, right? With actual armies. There was an actual war. I mean, yes, there was ethnic cleansing, but it was about a 3 to 4 week war in which Zionist forces fought a defensive war against, like we said, the Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi, and Lebanese forces, all of whom were, by the way, militarily inferior to the Zionist fighting forces. Zionists won't tell you that, but all historians agree on that. Benny Morris agrees on that. Yoav Gilbar agrees on that. Ilan Pape agrees on that. Now, where the disagreement is, during those 3 to 4 weeks, roughly from May 15th to about mid-June, they fought a defensive war. But then they got a truce signed. And then during the summer truce, basically between mid-June and July, August, they receive a massive weapons shipment from Czechoslovakia, which gives them not just the organizational advantage, right? The command and control advantage, not just fighting on your home front rather than having to fight an offensive war. So they had those advantages, but now they also had an arms and an equipment advantage after July, in which they go on multiple military offensives, which they didn't have to. Those were offenses of choice. Operation Hiram in the fall of 48, they expel 150,000 Palestinians from the Galilee. And they go on another operation in the south and expel another 100,000 Palestinians from the quote unquote Gaza envelope, all of these towns surrounding Gaza. So the point is, like, they got all these weapons in July, August, and then they go on 2 military offenses, which are offenses of choice, for the sole purpose of expanding the borders of the state. Remember, the state already exists. It's been declared in May. It was recognized in May by the Soviet Union and the United States. And it's going on more military offensive because it wants to, because it wants more land and it wants to push out more Palestinians from the contours of the Jewish state. That's the 1948 war for you.
I was going to say, before we get into the double Nakba stuff, the last thing that I think is important, because I would be remiss to not mention it.
But by the way, sorry, there was just one other thing I should have mentioned with regard to that clip we just saw, which was this narrative about the ethnic cleansing of the Jews across the Arab and Muslim world. We didn't address that, which we should have.
Yeah, we will.
That's the double Nakba.
Oh,
yeah,
you were about to talk about that. Oh, go for it. You can
the
intro
only
that.
thing I was going to say first pertaining to the 48 war was the Arab states, they intervened precisely because there was refugees fleeing into their capitals and they were responding to cries from their citizens. So it's not like they had this premeditated desire to go in and just destroy or push Jews into the sea, as you mentioned. Like, I believe it's Rashid Khalidi who describes I could be wrong, but I think he describes their intervention as like reluctant or more so belated, because they were responding to the fact that there was ethnic cleansings happening.
That's exactly right. Here you had these Zionist militias going door to door in April, in March, and April and May, and committing massacres, raping Palestinian women, expelling them from their homes, all kinds of horrible atrocities.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were an Egyptian or a Syrian, leader, what would you do? You want to defend your brothers and sisters in Palestine. I think it makes perfect sense that that they would have invaded, they're also staking their claims of leadership on defending the Palestinian people. So they also felt pressure, but they were not coordinated. They had very poor command and control. Their fighters were extremely poorly trained. There was no coordination between the various Arab fighting forces. So no, they had a distinct military disadvantage relative to the Zionist militias. Notwithstanding perhaps a military equipment advantage, which itself changed when the Zionists received those shipments from Yugoslavia in July 1948.
Yeah.
Or Czechoslovakia, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I make that mistake all the time. Similar
yeah,
sounding.
I guess the other point this has been a hot one. This has been one that people have tried to use to defend Israel. This sort of double Nakba thing that, well, actually, the Nakba doesn't matter because 1 million Jews were actually expelled from, people say Arab countries, but I guess the Middle East, North Africa region.
Yeah, so the first thing to say here is this may be obvious, but two wrongs don't make a right. Just because, sorry, that's not really the point I want to make. The point I want to make is there were some Jews in the Arab and Muslim worlds that not only faced discrimination and not only lost property, and not only had pogroms perpetrated against them, but you might even say they were expelled. There were a small number among that million, especially in Egypt after 1956. After Israel invaded Egypt in a neo-colonial war of aggression, there were some thousands of Egyptian Jews that were quite literally expelled. But that might be the only actual case of expulsion, as opposed to the 750,000 Palestinians, of whom many, many hundreds of thousands were very directly expelled, where it was you leave or you die. That was only the case with a very, very, very small number of those million Jews as compared to the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians. That's the very first point to make. Of course, the other point to make here is that, let's just even say they were all expelled. We'll get to what actually happened case by case in a minute. But what does that have anything to do with Israel expulsion of the Palestinians? That is something you need to take up with Egypt, and you need to take that up with Iraq, and you need to take that up with Yemen and Morocco. And those should be those interstate relationships and treaties and resolutions need to happen. We have nothing to do with the Palestinians, is what I'm trying to say. The other point is the next point to make here is the reason why. Ask yourself this: how is it that after quite literally centuries in which Jews around the Arab and Muslim worlds, not just in Palestine, but also Iraq and Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, were well integrated into those communities? What happened? Why did all of a sudden they start to face discriminatory laws? Why all of a sudden were there pogroms in places like Alexandria or in Fez or in Baghdad? Right? What happened? So the Zionist project was an attempt to transform an Arab and Muslim majority into a Jewish country. Lo and behold, there was blowback for Jews living in Arab and Muslim majority countries, which is the case with pretty much everything I know about human history. What we always know to be true is that when one group perpetrates an atrocity, it's members of that group that oftentimes, unjustly so, face blowback as a result. So the Zionists, first of all, have themselves to blame for the violence that was perpetrated against Jews in Muslim and Arab countries. That's the second point to make. The third point to make is that actually the vast majority of those Jews had no interest in going to Palestine. And the proof in the pudding, they may not have wanted to live in a country now where there maybe an occasional pogrom, where there's discriminatory laws, which was the case in places like Libya or Egypt or Iraq or Morocco. Most of those Jews actually wanted to go to Europe or the United States. And in places like Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, where the Jews living in those countries were able to go to France. They did. 90% of Algerian Jews went to France, not Israel. 10%. Because who the hell wants to go to Israel when you can go to France? And that was the perspective of the Jewish community of Algeria and of Tunisia and of Morocco. They had no desire to go to Israel. So that was the next thing. The next thing to say here is this wasn't a case of mass ethnic cleansing. This was a case of discriminatory law. Let me ask you this. Is there ethnic cleansing being perpetrated against Muslims in France? Is there ethnic cleansing being perpetrated against Arabs in the United States? Is there ethnic cleansing being perpetrated against Chinese people in the Philippines? is there ethnic cleansing being perpetrated against Afghani immigrants in the UK? So again, we have to distinguish between different types of persecution. Not all persecution is equal. There's discriminatory laws. There can be one-off pogroms, but that's different than ethnic cleansing. I'm sorry. You have to distinguish between different types of crimes. Otherwise, you're just you conflating things.
It's interesting because this individual that we're reacting to right now, I've contended with his double Nakba theory like very, very many times throughout, just like on my channels and stuff. And what he'll typically do is he'll point to Avi Shleim, because Avi Shleim is an Iraqi Jew, and he'll misconstrue some of the words in his memoir, The Three Worlds, and say, well, Avi Shleim actually agrees with me, with Ethan, with this guy, saying that there was actually a double Nakba. That's not true. In Avi Shleim's book, on the 17th pages, he says there is the double Nakba narrative is a myth, and it's propaganda of the victors precisely to create this false equivalence. Because when we actually look at what happened in all of these cases, case by case, you start with Morocco, you had Operation Yaqin, the deal with I think it was a governor or King Hassan II, to someone to basically like a payment where you would bring Jews to Israel for payment. Algeria, you had the Cremou Decree, which basically caused Jewish people to not have as many rights, to have more rights privileged over the indigenous Algerians. And then after colonialism ended, they went to France. Lebanon was seen as somewhat of a safe haven for Jews for very many years. And then when they did leave because of economic strife, they went pretty much anywhere but Israel. Iraq, there was discriminatory laws, of course, like there was. And there was also Zionist infiltrations. You had the Baghdad bombings in the 50s.
We didn't even talk about that. Yeah, I mean, there were these attempts to frighten Jews in places like Iraq by the Zionists. So that's another part of that story that Zionists will probably won't tell you much about.
Yeah, Yemen, you had this messianic fervor stoked by Zionist kind of agents to bring people over. And then they took, where did the kids go? The Yemenite children affair. That's another thing that's kind of left out of the conversation.
Then they don't. So then, by the way, there's so many pieces to this story that are not well appreciated. So after 1948, there's this narrative that the Zionist narrative will tell you, yes, they were ethnically cleansed, but also that, alas, after millennia of living in exile, all these Arab and Muslim Jews were just dying to go to Israel because of their lifelong like Zionist loyalties and commitments and passions. They just couldn't hold back. Now there's so much to say here. First of all, so the Zionist movement and then the state of Israel that superseded it had a selective immigration policy, and so what this meant was, in the aftermath of the establishment of the state of Israel, about 2/3 of Moroccan Jews that applied to move to Israel were actually rejected. Because, right, so you're like, wait, hold, what? Like Israeli Jews, Zionist Jews this drives them mad because they have this belief that not only did the Moroccan Jews want to go, okay, but Israel was just like welcoming them all because that was the whole point of Israel, was to save Jews fleeing persecution, right? False. That was not the point of the Jewish state. The point of the Jewish state was to create a Jewish country. It was not to rescue Jews fleeing persecution. It wasn't before 48 and it wasn't after 48. And in fact, you had about, like I said, 2/3 of Moroccan Jews were rejected by the state of Israel from 1948 to 1954. They only loosened the requirements after that. Why were they rejected? Well, because they were elderly people. They were families with children. They had diseases, leprosy, epilepsy. Zionists didn't want those things. Would burden the Zionist community, would be burdened by the state of Israel. Make sure those Moroccan Jews continue to suffer in Morocco so they don't burden the Zionist community. The same thing happened, by the way, in Germany after World War II. You had Holocaust survivors in Germany in 1948, 1949. You have Zionist emissaries going there, and you have these German Jews wanting to move to Palestine, Israel in 1949, and the Zionist officials like, these guys are all diseased. They're weak. That they're going to be a burden on us. They rejected Holocaust survivors who perished in Germany because Israel didn't allow them to move to Israel.
Tom Segev has a good book, The First Israelis. I think it's chapter 6 where he goes over this. He talks about how the Jews in Morocco and Algeria, I think he mentions that a Zionist agent noticed that I think he was only 20% of them needed to be saved, and 60 to 70 or 80% of them were relatively normal, which is the quote he used in that book. And he would constantly talk about how the Zionists would refer to these people, Holocaust survivors, that might be the 7th million, but Holocaust survivors and Jews of the MENA region as bad human material, which is what he would recount.
that was the word, that was the phrase that was used by the Zionist movement, was human material. Zionists were, the Zionist leadership in Palestine, long before 48, I mean, this is going all the way back to the early 20th century, were obsessed with this, like, what kind of Jews were they? They didn't just want random Jews showing up to Palestine. They were obsessed with the type of Jewish human material. And who did they want? They wanted wealthy, healthy, single ideologues, people that believed in the cause. So if you were a refugee, you wanted to move to Palestine because you were impoverished. You lost your means of livelihood. You had nowhere to live. By definition, you were unwanted because you wanted to move to Palestine based on reasons of need rather than for ideological reasons. Therefore, you were rejected. And the Zionist movement actually even convinced the British to reduce Jewish immigration quotas in the early 1920s after they saw a massive wave of pogroms in the Ukraine, after which quite literally 100,000 Jews were slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands of more were turned into refugees. This is after the Russian Civil War in Ukraine from 1918 to 1922. And you had all these Ukrainian Jewish refugees, hundreds of thousands of them, trying to find a safe haven. Chaim Weizmann goes to the British in 1920 and 1921 and says, we need to reduce these Jewish quotas. Because these Ukrainian Jews, even 1% of them, if even 1% of them wind up in, this is a direct quote. If 1% of them wind up in Palestine, it will ruin the movement. They will wreck the movement. It was like an anti-saving Jewish movement for the majority of its history.
Wow. I mean, it's kind of incredible because I've never heard that about Weizmann. I know that there's like David Ben-Gurion could have probably taken the decision to bomb the trains going to Auschwitz, as in to bomb and destroy train lines, to engage in militant resistance or to support militant resistance inside of Europe against the Nazis. And for some reason, he chose not to. And I think I read it in Adam Schatz's review of it's called "We Are Conquerors." Maybe it's actually Segev's biography, but it was a review of it. And he says it was never really explained, and part of it was, confronting this massive, like this unbelievable scale of slaughter, but also this thing of Israel's relationship with Holocaust survivors was incredibly complex. I mean, Segev's book as well details how Mizrahi Jewish people were told, basically, the Holocaust has nothing to do with you up until Menachem Begin comes to power. And you think about all of these cracks that are showing in the seams of Israeli society. It's not so much the Mizrahi now. It's more to do with ultra-Orthodox Jews who don't want to do anything apart from read Torah and don't want to serve in the Israeli military. It's not really this cohesive society made up of so many different people as Israel likes to claim, really, it seems.
Well, after World War II, Ben-Gurion, it's not that it's not that just that maybe he didn't do much to prevent the Holocaust from happening while it was happening. That wasn't their focus. The focus never was on rescue efforts. If anything, the Zionist movement saw rescue efforts as potential existential threats to the Zionist movement itself. Why? Because most rescue efforts, certainly in the 1940s, were rescue efforts to save Jews to Britain, the United States, France, Canada, somewhere other than Palestine. And those rescue efforts were deemed existential threats to the Zionist movement by Zionist leaders, because if they could be rescued to Canada and the United States, well, what was the point of Zionism in the first place? It was a narrative challenge to Zionism. And so what does Ben-Gurion do? He travels to the DP camps in Europe. He goes to Austria and Germany after World War II, and to the American zone. It's controlled by the Americans. And he goes in and meets with all the DP leaders and convinces them. And he basically sabotages these rescue efforts that were being undertaken by British, French, and American Jews. You had all these efforts. They were trying to take Jews to America, to Britain, to France, settle them in Jewish communities, host them in synagogues. And Ben-Gurion goes and says, not a single Jew goes to France. Not a single Holocaust survivor goes to Britain. Not a single DP refugee goes to America. Those Jews are needed to fight the demographic war in Palestine. And many of them died lingering and suffering in those refugee camps while they waited for Palestine to become Israel.
I remember as reading as well that, I think it's in Amy Kaplan's book, Our American Israel, I think she mentions that some Zionist agents were infiltrating camps in order to manipulate opinion polls, to manipulate kind of public opinion about where people should go. You know, they'd go in and they'd say, well, look, and they'd advocate exclusively for Palestine. And they're like, oh, it's beautiful, you'll be saved there. And, you know, it's kind of this horrifying story in reality of just sort of being like, yep, come do colonization and inflict onto Palestinians the horrors in part that were inflicted onto you by the Nazis.
They also started a draft in the DP camps. These are like the Israeli government launched a draft before Israel existed outside of the borders of the Strait of Israel. Think about that. To understand sort of just how obsessed this country is with its military, to understand the centrality of armed forces, of guns, of bombs, of violence to the Israeli project. They literally sent Zionist militias, like Haganah leaders, to the DP camps to start drafting. These are Holocaust survivors. These are people who just lived through 4 or 5 years of a Holocaust and are now being drafted against their will into a kind of armed force that was then, and then who, of course, were the first people invited to Israel, Palestine on May 16th, 1948. Was not kids, was not elderly people, was not people that needed saving and rescue, the people who were on their last leg, the people that were about to die in the DP camps. Nope, wasn't them, was fighters. Fighters were the people that were invited to Palestine. And it was the fighters that were conscripted in the DP camps against their will. Maybe some of them volunteered, but like it was a conscription. It was not a voluntary policy. So,
and I guess that kind of loops back into what we were talking about earlier about having to build these national myths to really underpin your project. And Segev touches on this. I think it's in the 7th Million, where he talks about how the Zionists, the early Zionists in the preliminary stages of Israel's existence, they adopted the idea of the Sabra, which would be like the muscular Jew, and they contrasted it to what they called the Galut, which was like the diaspora Jew, which was perceived to be, weak or small. And they thought that was actually a threat to their project, a project of, wanting to build strong, muscular people and be defiant and be able to, fight for themselves. And in that process, I think there's a newspaper that Segev recounts in the 7th Million that literally refers to Holocaust survivors as mice in flight and in other like disparaging terms, which really kind of lays bare this like sort of disgust really that these people had for Holocaust survivors because they were victimized by something completely out of their control.
You said it incredibly well, Isaac. You're exactly right. There was this shame. The Zionists, this shame, by the way, goes actually long predates the Holocaust, right? It was only, I think, magnified and exacerbated because the Holocaust was obviously the most extreme case of Jews facing persecution in Jewish history. But this idea of the Jews kind of accepting their status as subjugated, this long predates the Holocaust. In fact, this was the Zionist attitude in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s during the pogroms as well. And that's why the Zionists actually embraced Zionism, because they said they looked at these shtetl Jews, these pious Jews, these Torah-observant Jews who weren't muscular, who didn't engage in sports, who were weak, who were passive. They looked upon that with scorn and disdain. And by the way, just like the anti-Semites did. They agreed with the anti-Semites that the Jewish problem was a problem. Like the Jews needed to change themselves and to become new Jews, to become strong, muscular, independent, like secular, integrated into Western society. They believed all those things. They believed that the Jewish stereotypes were real and that they were a problem and then they needed fixing. And they aligned with the anti-Semites. Max Nordau, Theodor Herzl's right-hand man, if you read his novels in the 1880s, they're replete with all of these negative stereotypes about the Jews. Like he embraces all of them. And then he comes up with this theory that we need to be muscular, right? That we need to be strong, that we need to fight for ourselves. So in some senses, like Zionism was sort of the flip side of anti-Semitism, right? The Zionists and anti-Semites had a shared understanding of what it meant to be a Jew and what the solution to the Jewish problem was. And by the way, they both agreed on the solution as well, that in order for Jews to achieve their potential, they needed to get out of Europe. Like Europe was this diasporic existence, which was which made the Jews what they are. In order for them to reclaim their glory, they needed to leave the quote unquote diaspora and they needed to move to Palestine. The Zionists and the anti-Semites agreed on that.
Yeah, like I because obviously there's this assumption that obviously it was always evident that the Holocaust was going to happen. Obviously, the bigotry still existed, but when Hitler came to power, in my understanding, it was literally the thing he'd said that would happen is Jews will go. He didn't say like what that would mean. Mostly, it's people assumed that it would mean expulsion, and kind of the Zionists accepted this premise. I mean, it's also a transformational thing, isn't it? You know, you become European by going to Palestine and doing colonization. And look how well that's worked. Jewish people are now accepted predominantly by the people who, 50, 60 years ago would have most evidently been the proponents of Nazism. Some of the worst bigots, some of the people who have the most repugnant things to say about immigrants and whatever minority they can, for some reason have this undying, passionate love for the state of Israel. It's pretty obvious that they did it pretty well. They became Europeans by virtue of doing really brutal colonization.
It is one of the great ironies of history that if you look at which groups of people have been the most discriminatory towards minority groups, have been the most anti-Semitic, most hatred towards Jews, that list is like doubles as the same list of people and countries that love Israel.
Yeah.
It's one of the great ironies of history that Jew haters end up becoming the greatest allies of the state of Israel. Certainly much greater allies than people that actually treat minorities well and support minority rights and actually treat their Jews well. Remarkable.
I guess that kind of, do you still have a bit of time or do you need to head quite soon?
I can keep going, sure.
And then I guess it kind of takes us on to the anti-Semitism industrial complex, which is something I got from one of your tweets. And I'm assuming this comes in part from kind of, or Mohammed El-Kurd's work, where you said thought crimes are infinitely worse than murdering 100,000 people, the anti-Semitism industrial complex. You're Jewish. You've been to Gaza, right? Haven't you?
I have, yeah.
It's kind of crazy. I mean, actually, you know what? I think that's just worth talking about, the experience of being around people from Gaza and the way in which people claim that they're all perpetrating these evil thought crimes, and that means they're worthy of death.
Yeah, well, there's so much to say here. So, like, had the Jews been, had the Zionists that colonized Palestine embraced Buddhism rather than Judaism, you're telling me the Palestinians would have been anti-Semitic rather than anti-Buddhist?
Right.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So it's not about it. No one cared what the religion was of the people occupying and colonizing and apartheiding and genociding them is. No one ever has and no one ever will. That's not relevant.
Didn't they take issue with the Ottoman governors at times too? And they were like revolts against the Ottoman governors. Were they being Islamophobic then?
Right, exactly. That's a great question. And then also help me understand like how it is that like on the eve of Zionist immigration, the Jews of Palestine were probably better integrated into Ottoman Palestine than the Christians were. Probably better than the Druze were. The Jews of Ottoman Palestine, they had Muslim physicians. They celebrated holidays with Muslims and Christians. I mean, we could spend hours just talking about the intercommunal harmony between Jews, Christians, and Muslims on the eve of Zionist immigration, right? There was no anti-Semitism was not a concept that people would even understand what you're talking. You would have to spend like 10 minutes explaining to a Palestinian on the eve of Zionist immigration what anti-Semitism is. They wouldn't even know what you're talking about. Like what? Like that, there was okay. In 1890, the Jews would celebrate in the Arab neighborhood of Jerusalem known as Sheikh Jarrah. They would go to the grave of Shimon HaTzadik and they would throw a picnic there twice a year. And the Muslims and the Christians of Jerusalem joined them on the picnics. They celebrated together, like Muslims dressed up on Purim, the Jewish holiday. On Easter, the Muslims combined the Muslim Nebi Musa pilgrimage with Purim. With Easter. And then, by the way, the Jews had a holiday on Passover where they would like distribute sweets to Muslim, to believe that Palestinians have something against Jews and Judaism. Again, it's one of those things about Zionism that makes you stupid. It just makes you stupid because you have to believe things that are just patently false. So no, the whole anti-Semitism industrial complex has been, Norman Finkelstein wrote a good book on this decades ago, right?
Holocaust industry?
That's right. It is an industry whose sole reason for existing is to whitewash Israeli crimes. That's it. Mm-hmm. And so to give you a perfect example of how the industry works, you'll have a kid, a 21-year-old kid, 20-year-old kid, write something stupid, write something anti-Semitic and say, I don't want to work for a Jew. And so it's a thought crime, right? He vocalized a thought crime. He had a thought that was that now is going to stay with him his whole life because the anti-Semitism industry is going to make sure this guy never gets a job again. Now, take a Randy Fine, who is not like a kid. He's an adult. He's in his 50s, so he's intellectually mature. He's also like a U.S. congressperson, so he has power. So what he says actually matters. He called for there's so many things he has said that, it's not like having a thought crime. It's actually calling for extermination of an entire people. And yet he's still a congressman. And yet somehow he the anti-Semitism industrial complex doesn't seem to care at all about like how vile and genocidal he is. So they don't actually care about like anti-Semitism. There's no actual attempt to no one, like the Jew hatred in the United States has to spend your whole life obsessing over like discrimination against the most privileged cohort of human beings in all of human history is a weird thing. Okay. To make your whole life's mission dedicated to trying to make sure there's never a single person that ever says anything bad about the most privileged cohort of human beings on planet Earth is a strange thing.
It's there's Shlomo Sand has a book. I think it's his memoir. It's called How I Stopped Being a Jew. I know that's a seemingly decisive title. I would not read it out in public. But in that book, he talks about how he's more concerned with the victims of today than the victims of yesterday, because he thinks that if you focus all of your energy on the people who were victimized in the past, it kind of prevents you from being able to spot those patterns when they arise in different variations and target different people. And, this is such a really good way of shutting down the conversation. Like me personally, I've never been called an anti-Semite until I started talking about Palestine. It's really interesting. Like my cousins are Jewish. I've never had a problem with Jewish people. And I was very sensitive to that accusation when it first started being levied at me, because I was like, oh my God, my opinions on Jewish people don't change just because I'm talking about Palestine. I don't have a problem with them. But after a while and after doing this for a few years now, it's just kind of doesn't mean anything to me when people call me an anti-Semite anymore, which I think is also a bad thing. Like the value of that term is being completely stripped away. If an anti-Semitism, if we all agree, is a disgusting malignancy, and you strip the value away from the term that signifies if someone truly is one, there's going to be consequences that brings too. Like there's some sort of implications surrounding that.
Well said. Have you not been on Instagram recently? The things that people are saying on Instagram are unfucking believable. I was learning about how the Nazis were maybe controlled opposition who were brought in by Jewish people to fight a world war so that Israel could be created. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, the things that you are cooking up in here. All that apparently Israel killed JFK. Like a lot of this stuff, I guess that's not, that's not like...
Well, some of these conspiracy theories, was it Christians United for Israel, the 10 million strong organization was founded by that preacher, what's his name? Not Pat Robertson, the other one. Hagee, John Hagee. So John Hagee, by the way, shares that view. He's the founder of the largest Israel organization in the United States, the largest Zionist organization in the United States. It has 10 million members, Christians United for Israel. John Hagee is the founder and president of that organization, and he published a book, and he said this in interviews as well, which have also been scrubbed from the internet. But he published a book in which he said that Adolf Hitler was sent by God to planet Earth to rid Europe of its Jews, push them to Palestine to create a state of Israel. So again, they like, I mean, if your belief is that Adolf Hitler is some kind of divine manifestation, I'm sorry, like you're anti-Semitic, like you're also the most prominent Israel supporter in the United States. Full stop. Like again, like I said, anti-Semitism and Zionism have a shared history. But the deeper problem here, Isaac, is that you're right. The ADL in 2022 was no longer allowed to be cited. The ADL is the I call it the Apartheid Defense League. I forgot what it's actually called.
Me too. Anti-Defamation
League.
But because it defends apartheid for a living. That's all it does. It was no longer allowed to be cited in Wikipedia pages as of 2022. Wikipedia, by the way, is like not like exactly like the only thing Wikipedia does is like try and remove what it believes to be obvious bias. So that's how bad ADL was. They were no longer allowed to be their data that they collect on anti-Semitic incidents was deemed unreliable. This is in 2022.
I did a whole video essay on the ADL.
Okay.
Yeah, no, please keep sharing for the audience.
Because what they would describe an anti-Semitic incident is someone who goes to a protest against genocide carrying a sign that says "Free Palestine." So they would call that anti-Semitism. Okay, so like just to understand. By the way, the New York Police Department, same exact. It's not just the ADL. It's not even just these Zionist genocidal institutions. It's also like ranking like the NYPD. By the way, if you go to the NYPD, they have this anti-Semitism tracker, same thing. And if you go and look, they even admit it. There's this quote in the New York Times from one of the people who compiled the data. And he says, this is an incredible quote. I've tweeted about this before. He's like, well, we discovered that a majority, he even uses the word, I think most or majority, most anti-Semitic incidents are like actually related to Israel. Like he says it directly. He's like, there's no like, they can't find any actual anti-Semitism. So it's an entire industry with not just Jewish and Zionist institutions that lend its credibility to this industry, but that has infiltrated non-Jewish institutions, like public institutions like the NYPD, that has convinced universities like Columbia University and Harvard University, right? It's infected everybody.
Yeah, well, even the push to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is also very...
So you can so if you're a Columbia undergraduate student, you could be a Columbia professor, and you could call for, as long as you're describing your call in abstract terms, you could call for the violent overthrow of the United States government. That's protected speech. I mean, you could call, obviously, you could say black people are inferior to white people.
Yeah.
Like I believe that. Like I'm a student at Columbia and I think black people are inferior to white people. That's my belief. As far as I know, that's protected speech as well. I'm not violating, like that's America, First Amendment, free speech, you're protected. But if you say that when Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's security minister, when he said that for every tear shed by a Lebanese mother, for every tear shed by an Israeli mother, 1,000 tears should be shed by Lebanese mothers. This idea that, or when Smotrich said, for every FPV drone shot at an Israeli soldier in Lebanon, we're going to take down 10 towers in Beirut. So that's Nazi language. The Nazis, I mean, it's not like I'm not imagining it actually is Nazi language because the Nazis had reprisal policies. Like, for example, in Hungary, when a single Nazi soldier was killed, they had a policy where they would go and literally line up and execute 50 or 100 Jews. So this is literal Nazism. But if I say Nazism is Nazism, I'm in violation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism adopted by Columbia University, Harvard University, Cambridge University, and dozens of other universities. And therefore, those universities can expel me, they can suspend me for violating campus policy.
We just in the UK, there was a stabbing over the weekend, and it was done by a guy who was he specifically targeted Muslims, and he said, "I'm doing this to protect women and girls." It was released the same day that a politician, this happened like a few days after a politician released a bogus study claiming that Muslims had sexually abused 250,000 white women. We didn't have like a big conversation as a country about Islamophobia or bigotry in general. But when there was I need to drink some water. But when there was an attack carried out by a mentally ill person where he killed a Jewish person, he tried to kill Jewish people. There was a Cobra incident, which is like our national security. There was a meeting of the heads of state, Keir Starmer, everyone. When the Islamic State, someone who affiliated themselves with the Islamic State, the only transnational terror organization that has encouraged lone wolf attacks against Jewish people, when that happened at a synagogue in Manchester, the conversation was about Palestine protests. But yet when there's a stabbing of Muslims carried out by someone who is like, I am inspired by people who tell me I'm protecting women and children because all Muslims are evil sex offenders, we don't have a conversation about like how that is actually provoked by our politicians and media. Instead, we live in this world where anti-Semitism is elevated to the point where they have to cook up conspiracy theories that some guy who likes the Islamic State was radicalized by hearing From the River to the Sea and globalize the Intifada, because you just, you're right. All of this is just ridiculous insanity. And a big part of me thinks it's just about keeping people obsessing over it, even people who care deeply, who don't have any sympathy for Israel, just worrying about the content that they make, that they produce, that they're one day going to slip up and that'll be it for them. They'll never get a job again. They'll never be able to work again because the ADL said so.
Yeah, it's been a cudgel used. It's been a weapon used to silence criticism of Israel for decades. It's been on steroids for a few years now, and it's just getting worse. And ultimately, the only people that are suffering as a result, I mean, obviously the Palestinians whose murders are being justified and through this weaponization of anti-Semitism. But then, of course, obviously, it's also dangerous for Jews, for whom, as you correctly pointed out, Isaac, the term anti-Semitism no longer has any meaning. When there actually is real anti-Semitism, who's going to even believe it anymore? And by the way, I actually think there will be. How could there not be? I mean, when you have a country that calls itself a Jewish state, that claims to represent Jews, claims to act in Jewish interests, and has its allies and it has cutouts in every nook and cranny of the most powerful empire in the world, that is the United States government, and the son-in-law, and the negotiations advisor, Witkoff and Kushner, and like go down the Trump administration. By the way, go down the Biden administration, go down Trump 1 administration, go down
Clinton,
Obama, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush. Okay, maybe we have to go as far back to Bush 1 to really have some kind of meaningful shift here. Because remember, Clinton beat Bush 1 on a promise that George H.W. Bush threatened to suspend aid to Israel because Israel wouldn't stop building settlements at a time when George H.W. Bush was trying to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together at the Madrid conference in 1991. So, like, you have to go basically 25 years back to really see any kind of sort of shift in policy. But from Clinton to the present day, every single government administration in the United States, every single cabinet member, every single advisor to the president, every single UN ambassador, every single ambassador to Israel, everybody who played any role at all on Middle East, Israel-Palestine policy was a Zionist. Most of them were not like incidental Zionists. They were like lifelong, hardcore, committed Zionists who were Israel firsters. And that is the United States government for 30 years. And now it's being unveiled. I mean, those of us who do this for a living have been talking about this for years, if not decades. But for an average American who's waking up to this reality for the first time now and is actually discovering that not only is all that true, but now that same country that has been guiding U.S. foreign policy in Israel-Palestine for decades is also now refusing to let the MOU come into effect and is doing everything it possibly can to sabotage this United States-Iranian agreement and bring the world to the brink of global economic depression. Guess what impact that will have on Jews? It's not going to be positive. It's not going to be a positive impact on American Jews. And guess what? There will be more anti-Semitism when everyone realizes the Jewish state that is obsessed with Jews and claims to speak in the name of Jewish interests.
And brands the Star of David into its enemies.
And brands that Jewish supremacy onto the faces of Palestinians, onto the fields of destroyed homes in Gaza. That same state is now dragging the world into an economic depression. You think this is going to be good for Jews, but guess what? No one's going to believe the anti-Semitism because the ADL weaponized it, and Harvard weaponized it, and Columbia weaponized it, and Trump weaponized it, and J.D. Vance weaponized it, and everyone with any degree of any importance has been weaponizing it for decades. When it actually comes, no one's going to believe them. It will be the most incredible example of boy who cried wolf in all of human history, and there will be no one to say protect the Jews when they do face blowback because they've done it to themselves. I'm sorry. It's just I have so little tolerance now that, like, you know what? They brought it upon themselves.
I was just going to interject as well. You know, you're saying kind of like how dominant it is in American politics. Keir Starmer just resigns in the UK, looks to be replaced by Andy Burnham. The first thing people find of Andy Burnham is an old video of him going, "The first place I'll visit if I become the leader, Israel."
Yeah, I mean, it was that Mamdani clip, by the way. I mean, that's the reason why he became mayor. Because that clip was it was like a 1 minute clip. It was like a nothing clip. And it was clearly, it was just like that made Zohran Mamdani's campaign was like all his competitors lining up behind Israel for mayor of New York, because obviously as mayor of New York, your number one priority is foreign policy, right? So that made the Mamdani campaign. And I think also it really marked a shift. Like it kind of like, it just exposed so much propaganda with so little effort. It was just like, it highlighted what is wrong with America, what is wrong with the political establishment, the Dems, the Republicans, the Uniparty, all the mayors of New York, the whole New York elite, the whole New York establishment. It exposed so much with so little work. And there you go. Same clip in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I really have to say to that is, yeah, I'm of the belief that anti-Semitism right now is not institutionally protected in any of the upper echelons of society. I don't think you could be an anti-Semite and be a politician or have any career in, say, like higher office, anything of the sort. But I don't think that the same holds true for Islamophobia. I do think that Islamophobia is institutionally protected. That's why you can have a guy like Randy Fine saying that he would take a dog over a Muslim. If someone said that about a Jewish person, they would be lambasted rightfully. So my position is that I think we should focus on the people who are actually on the receiving end of institutionalized discrimination. But that holds true for Jewish people too. If the eventual shift does take place, like you mentioned, there's a likelihood that it will, as Israel's behavior has been repulsive and pissed a lot of people off. But when that does happen, then I see that as my job to say, well, hold on. Now the tables have turned. Now, hypothetically, anti-Semitism is being is institutionally acceptable again. And then I would change my tune. I would say, no, this is unacceptable. But I don't see that as the reality on the ground right now. That's why I don't harp on it.
You're exactly right.
Yeah. I just see my job to be, one thing at a time. What's the issue at hand right now? I think Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism and just colonialism and imperialism to be the issues that are driving the most amount of death and suffering around the world right now. So that's where I focus.
It is, I think, incumbent upon us, those people in the independent world, independent media, independent spaces, to hold the centers of power to account. That is what independent media is supposed to do. That's what all media is supposed to do. Corporate media doesn't do that. But independent media is supposed to hold people who have real power to account. And real power is institutional power, right? It's people who hold political office. It's people who have actual power to make decisions that affect the rest of us. You and I don't have that. And yes, when it comes to institutional power, I mean, there's It's the opposite. Anti-Semitism is the problem. It's the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is the problem. It's the people who are lying about anti-Semitism who have the power. And it's the people who use that as a weapon to silence criticism of Israel. Those are the people who have the power. Those are the people who can actually make change. And so as soon as that changes, I will change my attitude towards what we should be doing about anti-Semitism. But you're right. The people who have real anti-Semitic beliefs, I mean, they're totally marginalized. They have no power at all. They're
like on 4chan.
If they actually express the anti-Semitism, they're just beyond the pale. Like, I mean, look at the great lengths that the mainstream media will go to call these people beyond the pale. I mean, obviously, I'm no fan of Nick Fuentes, right? He is openly anti-Semitic, but just look at what they'll do to someone like Nick Fuentes. They will make this person, like, they will cancel anyone who talks to him, right? They will try. So if, like, you're actually an anti-Semite, even just being 1 degree of separation next to that person is cancelable. So you have to understand, they will do everything in their power to cancel anyone who's kind of openly bigoted. Whereas it's just obviously not the case with other forms of bigotry, as you correctly pointed out, Isaac.
Shall we close up the episode there, or is there anything else you wanted to add?
I'm good. If there's anything if you want to add, Zach, thank you so much for coming on. I was so excited when Chris told me that you were coming on. I was like, no way, because I'm a big fan. So thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure, guys.
I really wanted to have you on to just to chat about like some of the myths that I feel like I have answers to, but it's nice to have like, I don't know, this is way more your area of expertise, like 100%. And it was great to have you on, and I hope that everyone who's watched it has enjoyed it. You mentioned earlier, where can people find you though? You're quite prolific on Twitter.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter _Zach Foster. I have an Instagram. I also publish on Substack and also my own platform called Palestine Nexus, which we talked about already. But you can find all my work at PalestineNexus.com as well.
We'll link it in the description. It's a brilliant resource.
Yeah, everything will be linked below.
Well, thank you again, Zach, and yeah, thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you to our patrons on Patreon for making this program possible, with a special vocalized thank you to our top-tier patrons, the Wallace 3000, Megan Ratana, Storm's Daughter, Cedar Down Under, Riker G, Jamo, Space, Soph, and Demon Lemon.